Winner Circle Podcast. We interview dope brands and do community outreach. Check us out. Winner Circle Podcast. We're here live with another great episode. Today we have the honor of hosting Jeff Hobbs. He is the writer of the Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace and also Seeking Shelter. And I want to dive a little bit about how much of an awe I am of him and just his storytelling. But without further ado, Jeff, tell us a little bit about yourself and your mission as a nonfiction author.
Thanks so much for having me on your podcast. I'm really grateful to be here. And there's not too much to tell about myself. I'm a nonfiction author, and I originally wrote novels. And then when my friend Rob Peace, who we'll talk about, he died very tragically before his time, and something changed in my life where I felt very compelled to tell his story. And telling his story not only better connected me with a friend who I cared about very much and I miss very much still, but it also sent me down this different path as a nonfiction author, telling I would say stories of real people who aren't famous, people you wouldn't have heard of, but people whose stories I think matter and maybe help illuminate some parts of society that we need to understand better if we're going to make them work better.
Honestly, you said that perfectly. And that's how I know it was destiny that, we was able to get you on the show, because that's all we're about is sharing the stories of the overlooked. And I didn't know anything about Rob Peace. And just for being a young or, into my phase now of adulthood, a young Black man, when I watched that movie, it was so many things in Rob Peace that I saw in myself. And I said to you offline, I don't think I would have been able to resonate or even be impacted in the way I am now, not in terms of how I'm moving my life, if it wasn't for you to write that story in the first place. I don't think a movie would have been made. I don't think we will even know who Robert Peace is. So just thank you for that, man. I wanted to also just tell you that what you're doing is phenomenal, and we appreciate you. I know that you've already done a phenomenal job and a great job, but I know it's just a start and a tipping, a tipping point of where your career would be. But without further ado, let's get into it. I want to talk to you about specifically in terms of being a college roommate with Rob Peace. So how did you decide, or why did you decide to write about your college roommate, Rob Peace?
Sure. And I mean, it's interesting. We can talk about this more, but the way our things are portrayed in the movie, like our friendship and even like the dorm we lived in, was very different in real life from how it was portrayed in the movie, which I think is often the case with movies. And we can talk about like decisions they made and why, to my understanding. But yeah, Rob Peace was my roommate and my best friend for 4 years of college. And we met the first day freshman year with like a little handshake and a head nod, and we were trying to figure out where to get food and set up our room and everything. And so at the time we were at Yale, which is what it is. And at the time, all I'd known about Rob from like an introductory letter, we still wrote letters back then, was that he had gone to a prep school in Newark, New Jersey, and that he liked hiking the Appalachian Trail, and that he had played water polo. And so I assumed, aside from being a Black man, that he was probably a pretty typical like prep school Yale student. And I learned pretty quickly that he was not typical, and not just because he'd grown up the hard way and his father was in prison and his mother worked very hard for not much money. And it was an incredible journey for him just to get to college, let alone Yale, and to major in molecular biophysics and biochemistry and captain the water polo and all these things. Also, he was not typical in that he was just a wonderful person, a wonderful friend. Almost everybody loved him, and he just created this community. I will try not to ramble on too long, but
No, take your time. You can talk as much as you want.
he always created communities around him, whether that was just people sitting in a circle, like smoking marijuana and downloading their days, or his athletic community, or his more academic, like science track community. And he just always drew people toward him. And it was very special to be a part of that. And so when he died, like I said, too young, and it was a long story of how that happened. But I remember I was talking to his mom one of the first times after he died at age 30, and his mom said that her only consolation after losing her only son was that she knew that he'd influenced a lot of people for the better. And so I hoped through deciding to write the book about him with his mother's blessing, obviously, and her a lot of time spent with her. And then much later on, the movie that came out last year, I hoped basically that it would just let him influence more people.
Yeah, and as I said, it's doing just that, man. And let's pivot a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about you. How did you get to Yale, and what was your experience like, or maybe a little bit about your childhood and upbringings, and what led you to that point to meeting Rob Peace and him being your roommate.
Thank you for asking. I mean, I had grown up in a very rural area in Pennsylvania. I would say, pretty eventless childhood in the sense that my parents were together, and most of my life revolved around sports like football and track mainly. Just track, especially, was very important to me and my friendships. And actually, the first thing Rob and I joked about when we met was that I was a white guy who ran sprints on the track team, and he was a black guy who led the water polo team, which both seemed unusual. And so, yeah, I don't have too many interesting things to say about that.
Yeah, that's definitely hilarious. That dynamic is extremely funny because I would think you would be more so on the cross country side, and he would be the sprinter, right?
But yeah, we would go watch water polo games, which I had never really seen or heard much about water polo growing up. And it was a really rough sport, and he was very good at it.
Yeah, and in terms of that, I know it may have been difficult for you in capturing Robert's life and legacy. So when you were at the point when you wanted to write about write about his life, what would you say was the starting point for you? I know you mentioned you had a blessing from his mom, but I know it's like lots of emotions that was going through your head and just lots of stories and memories that you guys have already accumulated together. But where was the starting point and where did you decide to say, okay, this is what will resonate most with the audience and this is what people need to hear the most?
That is a really meaningful question. And again, I will try not to go on too long because I would say that the 3 years I spent, it took about 3 years to learn the whole story because, again, I just inhabited this fairly brief segment of Rob's life, 4 years of college. And, he and I kept in pretty close touch after college, and we lived on different coasts. He was a groomsman in my wedding, and we made the effort to talk on the phone as much as we could, and we always planned to see each other. And I mean, this is a roundabout way to answer your question because this is part of what kind of started the process of telling his stories was just the nature of our friendship and male friendship. Um, had to do with when we did talk on the phone, even if hard things were going on in my life or his life, we didn't really say it out loud. We'd get on the phone and we'd catch up and we'd say like, yeah, everything's all good. It's all good. And there were moments when things were definitely not all good
Yeah.
with me sometimes and certainly with Rob as life went on and he struggled with some decisions and how to kind of extricate himself from some influences back home that weren't great for him, those sorts of things. And so actually what started telling the story was this I was just reflecting a lot on what friendship really meant and all the things that I would have wanted to know and that so many people in his life would have wanted to know because he was just surrounded, as I said, by people who cared about him. But because of this mantra, like, it's all good, I'm all good, a lot of people just didn't know how to help him, if that makes sense. And so then and so Rob, lived this wonderful life, and he was a high school teacher and had some plans to get back into science. And he died in about 90 seconds of chaos that had to do with marijuana in his basement that he and some friends had been selling around the neighborhood. Keyword marijuana. This is 2011 that this happened, and it was just a terrible thing. So the word you used earlier, legacy, felt wasn't a word Rob probably used that much, or I didn't hear him use it. Like, he wasn't like grandiose when he talked about himself like that. But it just seemed like he died in this chaotic moment, and the way that moment was reported in the paper was just like Yale grad dies dealing drugs, and nobody wanted that to be his legacy. And so that's why I reached out to his mom about maybe just spending some time telling the real story of him, and creating hopefully some kind of real positive legacy for him out of that.
That's awesome, man. And in creating that story, let's go back into, maybe living some of those moments in the college dorm, way even before that horror in 5 seconds happened. You mentioned that, it's some details in the movie that aren't too consistent with what really happened. And that's okay. Movies make things a little bit more than what it is. So let's talk about maybe your freshman year and all the way up until the senior year. What were some things that were different in the movie in comparison to real life? Like, for example, the moment that in the movie for me, the moment that I was just like itching on the couch is when you finally found the phone and you realized that he had been talking to his dad the whole time. Like, was that an instance that was real, or how did that really play out?
Yeah, so that is actually a really, I'm so glad you brought that moment up, because that's one of those things where in the movie I mentioned earlier that Rob's father was in prison for most of his life. His father was in prison for a murder that Rob at least was deeply convinced he did not commit, that he was wrongfully incarcerated. Myself, having done many months of research into his father's trial, and talked to a lot of people who were witness to that crime in 1987. Um, uh, it's hard to think Rob was wrong. It's hard to believe that his father was innocent. And so in the movie, they had it like Rob was having these secretive conversations because he didn't want his Yale classmates to know that his father was incarcerated. And actually, in fact, like, he didn't get into detail about that, but he did not hide the fact that his dad was in jail. And in fact, I mean, I would talk to his dad on the phone sometimes. Like, his dad would call from jail. Rob was also constantly working on his case. That part is definitely true. And so I would have conversations with his father. And so, there was some privacy. Rob definitely didn't like talking about his father, but it wasn't dramatically concealed like it was in the movie. And otherwise, I mean, there's like a moment in the movie where he's with the water polo team, and they're kind of like preppy guys, which was definitely true. And he introduced them to like his friends at a house who were like his marijuana friends who were,
Owners, yeah.
yeah, and they made kind of a big moment in the movie of that. I think he said like, we're going to integrate the neighborhood or something. And again, like I said, in real life, Rob's circles was very warm, and like any given moment he'd be in our little living room with like athletes and like kind of stoner kids and international students and people who wrote plays, and people who were on pre-med. And it was just always this diverse group of people who were kind of joined by the commonality of being Rob's friend. That's how he was. Those are two moments in the movie that I would say were a little different.
That's awesome. And then in terms of your friendship and being his best friends, I know you talked about, sometimes speaking to his dad on the phone and even, doing research on the murder case revolving around his dad. What would you say like was, and I know it's been a long time, but what would his day-to-day dynamics look like? Like, I know in the movie it painted out to be like he was just so zoned in on his schoolwork and then his dad's case. But how did Rob's life look like outside of that? How and how was your friendship? Would you guys like always hang out, or was he like kind of like standoffish at times? Like, describe a little bit about your relationship with Rob in conjunction to how he actually handled himself with everything else that was going on in his life.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, if you kind of look at the big picture of what he was dealing with in his life, like Rob had very real, very heavy, everyday weights that he was carrying. Not just obviously his father was, he believed, wrongfully imprisoned, and he was involved in trying to raise money and raise legal fees to get his father out. And that is part of the reason he sold marijuana on our college campus, which didn't seem like a big deal kind of at the in the moment. But so that is one weight he was carrying, but also like he missed his mom, and his mom, you know, from a very young age, he'd been sort of like the man at his mom's house, and she, you know, cried herself to sleep some nights, and he felt guilty for that, and he missed his friends from back home, people he'd grown up with who maybe couldn't go to college because of financial or other reasons, and he felt like he was leaving them behind. So those are two very big weights. Academically, he was like tops. He never had trouble keeping up, being ahead of everybody. Like, you know, he always had kind of a girlfriend. He did very well with girls, but there was always some drama going on there. And I would just say that he was, as a friend, he was just extremely generous. Like he listened, he never made you feel like you were taking his time. Um, and, you know, my problems being much kind of lower caliber than his problems, but he listened to people and he listened to me. Um, I would say, again, I don't want to be like the whole movie is false or anything, but I mean, the movie had to, because it's 2 hours or less, had to focus very hard on certain things. But, and so Rob in the movie is constantly talking about his place and his legacy. And in life, you know, he just wanted to hear what was going on and he wanted to travel. That was probably like one of his greatest priorities in life was to travel the world, which he did. He traveled to Korea and Brazil and Eastern Europe and Portugal, and I mean all over really. And yeah, so I'm kind of going down memory lane a bit just because he was a
That's
very good.
okay.
But yeah, I mean one time we were sitting around and he said like, Jeff, you know what I like about you? Uh, and I was curious. I said what? And he said because it's all good with you. And but I mean I feel like a lot of his relationships were like that, and it's part of why he was such a good friend.
That's awesome, man. And you mentioned a little bit about how he felt guilty about, some nights not only missing his mom, but even growing up and hearing his mom cry herself to sleep. And I know that you had that time to build that relationship with her, as you stated earlier, and having her, giving you a blessing to write about his story. So, what would you say was some of the challenges that you had in honoring or portraying Rob's mother in your story?
She was actually very easy to portray. Well, I shouldn't say that. So I mean, about 6 months after Rob died, I'll just describe our first conversation about it, which was a very kind of emotionally loaded conversation, but it also tells you a lot about who Rob's mom is. I went to her home, and at the time, I thought that. I mean, I had mentioned some of the news coverage when he died was extremely negative, and I went to her home and I thought maybe I could just write like a 1,000 word piece for like his high school newsletter, something of that nature. And I went to something that wouldn't take very long and might just speak to his life and not only his death. Again, this was back in like 2000. So I went to her home. I sat with her and I said, if it wouldn't be too painful for you, I'd like to do this. And a lot of his friends supported this idea. And I was trying to be honest, like I didn't necessarily know what I was doing and I didn't want to cause her any more hurt by making her remember. certain things. And again, I wanted to sort of be truthful to what kind of a person Rob was, but without also acknowledging, some of the harder aspects of his life involving his dad and involving drugs, marijuana. Anyway, I kind of like I'm doing now. I just blurted this all out to her. And also, I said the fact that I'm like a white guy telling even a small story of his community and his family, I wasn't sure if anybody would be comfortable with that. And
Yeah,
and she actually laughed in that moment. And she said, like, you're sitting 5 feet away from me in my living room. I know that you're a white guy. But in the end, she just said that it would be nice for someone to do that. And it would be nice for one of Rob's friends to do that for him. And I think she was mainly just moved that people still cared enough.
that's awesome, man. And I want to also, if it's not too graphic or too triggering, I want to talk about those 90 seconds in his basement. I just want to know in terms of what did it really look like in real time? And I know you weren't really there, but based off of what you heard from his friends and based off of what the news were saying and in correlation, or I can say in contrast to the movie, what really happened? From what I gather, I know that he was trying to do a real estate business with his friend, but things went bad with the market. So he went back to selling weed or marijuana. And then he got into it with a little bit of like a neighborhood rivalry and things of that nature or competition there. But if to your best of your memory, tell me a little bit about what happened and what led to those 90 seconds, and particularly
Oh,
if there's
yeah,
any difference in the movie to real life.
sure. I can speak to that. And thank you for asking. And I would say, I mean, as far as what led up to those 90 seconds and what engendered those 90 seconds, I mean, I would say that this is a story. I think maybe what resonates about Rob and his story for a lot of people, and I didn't know that many people would read the book when I was writing it. Again, because he wasn't famous, and the story has a sad ending. But I think that what resonates is that there's a very American narrative to what got Rob to Yale, like all the hard work and all the good fortune and all the many people who cared enough about him to help him get to a place like Yale, and just that kind of educational everything that represents in the country, both like real and not real. But also what happened after Yale, where he again like missed his friends, he missed his mom. He decided to go back home from Yale instead of like going to grad school. He wanted to like check back in on them, and so he ended up teaching at his old high school and being near home. And a lot of people thought that that was a big mistake that he was making. But those of us who knew him knew how much he cared about his hometown and his loved ones. And then he was home, and some of those grad school opportunities started to fade away as time passed, and as things do sometimes. And then, like you said, he was kind of reconfiguring his life, and he had this real estate venture that was going to hopefully be a money generator and also help kind of rehabilitate some parts of his neighborhood. And he had all this going on, and hopes were pretty high, and he just needed a little bit more to get there. And he was also trying to help his dad out, and then his father died um, in prison, and that left a hole. And so, there was all this complex kind of very personal things going on with him, and also all these big kind of American dreams also going on with him all at the same time. And he was selling some marijuana, some quantity of marijuana. And, it wasn't like marijuana was dangerous, but money was dangerous where he lived. And people thought he had more money than he did. And I think that's what led to his death, which was like a home invasion. The murderer was never caught. And so I heard, while I was telling the story, I heard a lot of different ideas and theories about who did that and why. But I mean, I kind of know it's pretty clear what I believe happened, which is pretty similar to how the movie portrayed what happened to him. But yeah, nobody was ever caught for that.
Yeah. and, that's the saddest part, things like that happen, and it's like I said, we had the opportunity to hear from you and from the movie, how things like that play in our culture and communities, but it's so many raw piece out there that has happened to, and where murders go unsolved and so forth. But thank you so much for, in such little time, because I know we can go more and more into the book and specifically Rob Peace's life. But I want to talk to you about, the storytelling and also Seeking Shelter, another book that you wrote. So from Robert Peace to Seeking Shelter, I guess the question I have next for you is, how did one book lead to the next book?
Thanks for thinking of that. And actually, so I wrote about Rob, and and that book came out in 2000 and was very meaningful. Both just the privilege of telling his story, and it did reach more people than we thought, and it seemed to start a lot of conversations and connect people, which were all again things that mattered to Rob and that he was good at. And so that was a very powerful experience for me. And so I've actually written 3 books since The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. And so one thing that happened with Rob's stories, I got to visit a lot of high schools, colleges and high schools, and just visit, small groups and English classrooms and student clubs like affinity groups, and just talk like we're doing, kind of get reflections from students about the story and where they're going in life. And so that led to me writing a book about another nonfiction book about high school seniors in very different neighborhoods, different kinds of schools in Los Angeles, and what it looked like for them applying to college. But you can kind of see some parallels with Rob's story, because that was such an important part of Rob's story, and so that was really neat just to get to be with different families on that journey. And then another very impactful thing that happened had to do with Rob's relationship with his father, and I got the opportunity to visit a lot of juvenile halls over the years. And I wrote a book actually about the juvenile justice system, just because I felt like a lot of people know, obviously, that there's a system of incarceration of minors in America, but I think a lot of people don't understand what that system really is, and the fact that these are also schools, and kids who are put in jail for crimes still have to go to history class and math class. And so I wrote a book about that, and then every student I spent time with in juvenile hall, every single one spoke to me about housing instability that they had experienced. And so that book led to me writing a book called Seeking Shelter, which is about the journey of one family, a mother and her 5 kids in Los Angeles, as they survived being homeless for almost 5 years. And so that's the last book I wrote, was called Seeking Shelter.
And if you can, in conjunction to from Robert Peace to Seeking Shelter, what would you say was the thematic thread in connecting all those works? I know you mentioned that a part of Rob's life in terms of incarceration with his dad and also
Yeah.
just, struggling to make ends meet for his mom played a role in all three of those books. But could you define maybe one other thing that actually connected those things together, or was just those
Yeah.
primary
Oh,
things with Rob Peace?
absolutely. And I apologize if I was kind of drawing a very like meandering line through those works, but a very direct line between Rob Peace and Seeking Shelter has to do with just a mother's love, and what a mother's love is capable of creating in the world. Mothers just like a really indomitable ability to care for her children and bring them through tremendous hardships is really what Seeking Shelter is about. It's about a mother just homeless with her kids and sleeping in their car a lot, but every single morning dropping her kids off at school, picking them up, doing their homework with them, bringing them along the path. So that's very similar to Rob's mom's ability, what she did for Rob. And then another thing that's very important that I also think is important in America is one thing Rob's mom came back to again and again in my conversations with her is that she would never have been able to raise Rob and see him through school and see him to Yale if she didn't own her own home. Uh, And in this case, Rob's grandfather, his maternal grandfather, had worked in a factory and bought this home and left it to his daughter. And so just the home ownership was really what enabled a lot of Rob's brightness and stability to get where he got. And that ability is becoming more tenuous as time and generations go on, not less tenuous. And so I felt like it was important.
Yeah, that is extremely important. Because even, I'm 29 and I can say most of my peers, and I know that we're still growing, but when it comes down to home ownership, that's not something that we really talk about a lot. And the impacts of it and just passing on that legacy or that generational opportunity to the next.
Yeah, that word again.
Yeah, and honestly, from just a little glimpse into talking about seeking shelter, if there was opportunity for that mom to having a home, she wouldn't have been able to sleep in the car with their children and struggled as much. I mean, granted, issues would have probably still arise throughout the process of raising her kids, but just having a home definitely makes a difference. And I want to talk next about maybe the lessons learned while researching and writing about homelessness. What impacted you the most, or what did you learn most in terms of researching and writing about homelessness, specifically about that family and seeking shelter?
Well, I learned a lot, but I would say a very important thing that I learned had to do with the way that homelessness is perceived and a lot of the way the government frames the crisis of homelessness and the way that government systems count people who are homeless. A lot of it is geared toward like this monolithic perception of what homelessness is, this binary, like you're either like a thriving housed person or you're a destitute homeless person who can't hold a job. That's not my words. That's kind of how it's projected in America at the
Yeah.
moment. And just learning this particular mother's journey where she went to work every day. She worked at Applebee's and like I said, got her kids to school and back and just pieced together like below board housing situations. But she wasn't that far from being able to take care of herself. She just needed like a little moment of real stability to get her bearings and get some savings. And because all the systems are kind of built on this idea of triage and like emergency, it took her years to find a shelter system that could just give her that space to breathe a little bit and to save and find stability. So I think that if people realized just how close a lot of homeless families are to actually stability and just giving them just that little bit of help needed, I think we'd be able to reach a lot more people.
Think you hit it right on the spot, man. So just to be transparent with you, I lived in Atlanta back from 2020 through 2022. Early 2020, I would say. And at that time, I didn't have a job. We were doing a podcast with another business partner of mine at the time, and things were going fairly well. We were getting bookings from the show, and I had the opportunity to splurge, or I would say enjoy that young adulthood life a bit. But I didn't have stability. I was literally living check to check or opportunity to opportunity. And when that opportunity ran out, I dealt with homelessness for a bit. I would sleep outside of a church, and you brought up a point that I wanted to see if I can drive home in terms of like, it's really a thin line in between having that help and just really pushing through it. Because when I would go to homeless shelters, it would be so many people outside that needed the help, but it wasn't enough room. It wasn't enough openings for everybody to come. So let's say the homeless shelter opened up at 5 a.m. They would probably only take 8 people in, but there's probably like 50 through 100 people outside. And as you're talking about her story, I kind of envisioned that's probably what she was probably going through, but probably worse. Because sometimes they wouldn't accept people inside the homeless shelter if you had kids. And in some homeless shelters, they would accept only your kids. So, and being that she had to go to Applebee's to work and also take her kids to school, like that dynamic itself, like, hit me hard in terms of like, I don't know how she was able to go through that and make it out of it. So I appreciate you and I applaud you for telling that story because a lot of people can resonate with it. And for people who can't, we will understand or at least grasp a better understanding of that dynamic. Like, hey, like just because you see somebody on the street, that doesn't mean they don't have a story or that doesn't mean they're not close to having housing or close to their breakthrough. It just comes down to the resources, just like as you mentioned, the triage in the community that's there that's preventing them from getting that breakthrough.
Thank you for sharing that, and I'm sorry for what you went through. Similar to what we were talking about, Rob Peace, earlier, just the idea that it is pretty easy for us to judge other people's, like, the surface of their narratives, and judge it as positive or negative based on just a very few points of information. Rob sold marijuana. Evelyn, in seeking shelter, couldn't afford housing in Los Angeles. And it's easy to take those points of information and just create our own narratives that are, negatively charged. And like you said very nicely when we started speaking, writing books isn't necessarily going to solve big problems, but the hope is maybe it helps people stop and think about the whole story.
Yeah. And that brings me to my next point that I want to tackle with you. And throughout your time and just the research, the effort, and just the books that you've written, how would you say it has reflected on your life? Like, what changes have these book inspired in your life?
That's a um, that's a very generous question, and I would sort of say we spoke earlier in the conversation. You asked about growing up, and again, I told you it was pretty unremarkable. I lived kind of in the country and grew up with the same people, and had, I would say, a fairly I guess I was like insulated. I just didn't get outside my world that much until I went to college. I would say that telling these stories and all these people who are very trust me to tell their stories and are generous enough to share their stories and their time with me in the hopes that something positive will come out of it. It takes a lot of courage for people to do that, and it takes a lot of trust, and I would say it keeps me more open-hearted, and I think it makes me a better dad. You'd probably have to ask my kids, but I think it helps me kind of navigate the world with my kids, hopefully being good people.
Yeah. And in conjunction to that, what is your hopes in for people who are reading your book and channeling the perspective of these stories? What I really want to say is if I'm somebody that don't even correlate or understand any of these stories, what is your hope in terms of like how can this shift a perspective or influence action in someone that who is diving into these books and storytelling?
I hope that, and I think this is where just almost all nonfiction storytelling um, will always have a lot of value in the world. Reading true stories is just the opening up of a generosity of spirit that I believe almost all of us have, but in kind of the narrow paths of our day to day lives, it's very easy to. Um, it's not that it's easy; it's almost necessary to just focus on what's in front of us and our families and what we need to do for work and to take care of ourselves. And I think that that reading nonfiction and particularly stories of like these messy stories of struggle and triumph and everything that people go through, I think hopefully just opens people's hearts. And even if reading seeking shelter, I don't necessarily think everyone's going to run out and like volunteer at a shelter and start engaging with the community that way. I mean, I hope some people do, but I think more realistically, I hope people might be able to have more holistic conversations with their families and their kids and their coworkers and make the world better that way.
Yeah, and I definitely agree to that. From what I gather, man, it's really about truth. And as you stated, generosity and lastly, empathy in the field of nonfiction. And I want to actually shift into now like the author's perspective. More so what you guys bring to conversation about real stories. From an author's standpoint, what do, authors need to pay attention to in terms of like the ethical standpoint of it and writing about real people?
Right. I mean, ethically, all I think trust matters and honesty matters. Like always, just being upfront with everybody. I mean, I always let people read what I write about them before it's published, so that people are comfortable and to be as kind of honest and truthful as possible when I'm relating these stories. And then uh, I would say that. As far as the value again of these stories, and this actually relates to an earlier question about kind of my own life. It has to do with like, I mean, real life is messy, right? And and what you very nicely shared about your life, it sounds like it wasn't always a straight line, and you didn't always get from point A to point B to point C. And I don't think many lives kind of move cleanly like that. But I think when we are talking about other people's stories, we try to put them in that box, right? And kind of ignore how messy life can be and the fact that decisions that people are making, even if they seem totally unreasonable when you're observing them make decisions, to the person making that decision, it usually makes sense, right? And just like you said, the word empathy, having that empathy to always keep that in mind, because those, I think, in terms of interpersonal connections, that's just really the first things we lose sight of is that empathy, and the ability to kind of like appreciate how messy all of our lives are and how much we need each other to get through to the next step, hopefully all the way to point B.
Yeah, and I think you put that perfectly. And from what I gather from you is and I know I mentioned earlier, you did a really good job in your books and getting out that truth and the generosity and the empathy. But I think you did a really good job in also balancing intimacy and objectivity. And I would just, how I like to end this is honestly, is there any advice that you would have for aspiring nonfiction writers in how they can balance that intimate level of storytelling, but also remaining objective to, the goal and the point of it all?
Sure. I mean, I definitely feel like usually not qualified to give advice, but at the same time, I do teach on the side. So I think about this a lot. But I just think, going into a story, we always, I think we can't really help it as human beings. When you go into an experience, there's like the way that you want it to work out, the way you foresee it working out. In the case of telling a story, the way you see the story ending in your mind's eye. And just to writers, I would just say, understanding that it's never going to work out that way, and it's always going to go sideways, and that actually is part of what makes the profession kind of wonderful and makes the profession of storytelling very connective, is that you go on these journeys with people even if their story has already happened and they're just telling it to you after it's happened. You're still going on that journey with them. And I think sometimes the act of listening to another person's story, whether you're a writer or a friend or just a person on the bus, is a very it's a great gift. And I think in Rob Peace's case, certainly, I feel like if he'd let more people just listen to his story, I think maybe things could have turned out different, and he'd still be here.
Yeah, I definitely feel that a lot. And, sometimes it's, as you mentioned, when you guys would check in post college, You kind of sense like things aren't always okay, but sometimes as men, we just kind of like brush it off the shoulder and be like, yeah, things are good, bro. Things are all right. And I think I'm learning not only from you, but also from Rob Peace's story and from just my own personal life that when things are okay, being vulnerable, helps sometimes. Sharing the little that you can, even if you can't voice it all the way, helps because you just never know. You might get the right word or the right opportunity or the right resource to drive you home. So I really appreciate you, Jeff. It's really been an honor. Really been an honor. What I want to end off with, just tell us where we can find your books and more of your upcoming works and things that we need to look out for. Maybe are you working on something right now? Do you want to spill the beans on that, or you just
Well, no, I'm in very early stages of a couple of things that aren't worth talking about yet. Yeah, I'm always working, and I love this work. So thank you for having me on and being so nice about my work, which is available. I mean, I have a website, jeffhobbsauthor.com. I mean, everything's available on bookshop.com if you like sort of supporting independent bookstores, or amazon.com if that's the easiest way to find books.
perfect? And guys, if you want to follow him on Instagram or want to just see about, a little bit about Jeff, I know he posts his family, which always has me smiling. It's at Jeff Hobbs Writer on Instagram. But thank you so much, Winter Circle family. And thank you so much, Jeff. It really means a lot once again. And stay tuned for more episodes and peace out.
Thank you. I'm so grateful.